right. Welcome back to Paleo Talks, everybody. We are in 2022. Yes, 2022. That one I'm not used to saying yet. And our first episode of the year, and we have Eugenia Gold. Good to see you. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm excited to be here.
And we're really excited to having you. We're getting a little bit rusty, actually. We haven't done this in a little while. So excited to be back and have everybody out there listening in. And we'll get back to introducing our guest in just a moment. If David could remind everybody how the show works.
Sure thing. Welcome back, everybody. Happy New Year. I was just thinking, I got to remember what I say. I don't remember my lines. The program format is the same as it was in previous years. In just a little bit, we are going to hand the reins over to our guest for their presentation. But once the presentation is done, the rest of the program is Q&A. So our group here will have some questions, but we encourage you, the audience, to send in questions at that time as well. So when the time comes, you can leave your questions as comments on the Facebook video, or if you can't leave a comment on Facebook for whatever reason, you can send us your question at the Gray Fossil Site Twitter or Instagram account. I'll be keeping an eye on those as well.
All right, and it looks like we have Chris Widga with us again today, holding down the fort out at the museum. How you doing, Chris?
Good, glad to be back.
All right, me too. Well, just a reminder to everybody, we're coming to you from the Center of Excellence in Paleontology at East Tennessee State University, where we oversee the research at the Gray Fossil Site and Museum. And one of the things we do too is host this Paleo Talks series, which, as David mentioned, you can always find out there on YouTube afterwards. And our guest today, we're really excited to have Eugenia with us, Eugenia Gold, and talking about archosaurs, talking about flight. As David mentioned too, just a great way to kick off the year. And the way we like to get this going is to have you tell us about yourself, a background of how you got interested. I think you're one of those that got interested from an early age, probably in dinosaurs. If you could tell us that history and all the way up to the present, your degrees, all of that. And you don't have to, go into excruciating detail, but just give us the highlights.
All right. Well, like you said, I'm Eugenia Gold. I was born in Buenos Aires, Argentina. I moved to Maryland when I was 2.5. Obviously, with my family, I didn't just pack up as a 2.5-year-old and say, I'm out of here. I have loved dinosaurs since my first conscious memories. So by the time that I've started making memories of my life, I already was interested in dinosaurs. I remember asking every year in elementary school if this was the year we were going to learn about dinosaurs, and my teachers were always like, no, not quite. And it wasn't until college that I finally got to take a dinosaurs course with Dr. Tom Holtz. So I enjoyed that immensely and graduated with 2 degrees, one in geology and one in biology. I did a master's at the University of Iowa with Dr. Chris Brochu, and then I did my PhD with Dr. Mark Norell at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. I did a postdoc for 3 years at Stony Brook University teaching medical students anatomy. And now I am at Suffolk University in Boston teaching undergraduates anatomy and physiology and bio in general, and some historical geology in there as well.
All right. Well, thank you for that overview. And I can only imagine not having a dinosaur class and then having Thomas Holtz in a dinosaur class. That must have been extraordinary.
It was excellent. It was actually everything that I had hoped I would get out of a dinosaur class. And I liked it so much that the next year I happened to have a class in the same lecture hall before and after his dinosaurs class, and he let me sit in
nice
dinosaurs again, as long as I was quiet and not disturbing. So
incredible.
It was great.
And when you were doing your master's, what did you work on with Chris Brochu?
I worked on the Indian gharial, Gavialis gangeticus, and was looking at how the brain case changes over time. And so I got the CT scan at hatchling gharial, and they're critically endangered. They're super rare in collections, and this little baby was about this long from head to tip of tail. So it was really small. And I got to segment out its skull and look at how some of those bones change over the course of its life.
Yeah, I've seen those scans online. They're amazing.
Yeah, they're beautiful scans.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Well, let's go ahead and get started with your presentation. If you'll
Sure.
show your screen.
All right. Does everyone see that okay?
Looks good.
Okay, great. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about birds, brains, and the evolution of flight. And one thing I like to make sure that I talk about just up front here is that people generally think that science is really linear, that you get an idea for something, you do some really successful research, and then you publish on that idea. And it's not. That's not how science happens. Oh, no, that's not gonna work. Hold on one second. I've ruined my screen. All right. Sorry about that. So that's not how science actually works. Usually you get an idea, you start to do research on it, it doesn't quite work out. You have to go back and get more samples, you go down this rabbit hole of research, you have to reanalyze stuff, you try to publish it, you get multiple rejections for a number of reasons, and then you publish it. Sometimes you get an idea and you do really successful research and then you publish it directly, and that's great. But a lot of the time that's not how that happens. And I like in my talks to make sure that I present both sides of this, that it's not just this linear process. It's not, I try not to give just a highlight reel, because that is, I feel, disingenuous to how science actually works. And I want to make sure that people going into this field have an actual reasonable idea of how this happens. So I'll try to make sure that to mention how many times I rewrote drafts or redid analyses or all of that sort of information as I go along. Okay, so birds. Birds have been evolving on this planet since 150 million years ago. And in that time, they become one of the most speciose tetrapod clades, comprising over 10,000 extant species. Some estimates are over 15,000 extant species. And they span 5 orders of magnitude in size. So the smallest one is the bee hummingbird. Here is very small, and the largest being the modern ostrich at something like 7 feet tall. Not only that, but they occupy an incredible diversity of ecological niches. They fly, they swim, they run, they're all over the planet. And what I find interesting about them is that their brains are actually quite comparable to mammal brains. We like to think that mammals are the, the scala naturae, the top of the ladder in terms of brain evolution, but birds have a very packed brain in terms of how many neurons they have per area of their brain. It's in some cases twice as much as mammals do. So birds are able to do some incredible things with their brains with less overall brain tissue than mammals do. So here we have a starling on the top here and a rat, and their brains are basically the same size, but the starling has more neurons per area than the rodent here does. So that translates into birds being able to do some incredible things. So this crow is actually using these little weights to change the level of the water so it can get its little meaty snack out of that tube. And it understands that the first weight was not enough to do that, and it goes back and gets a second weight to increase the level of water so it can get that little snack out of there. This is one of the many examples of tool use in birds, something that we previously thought was limited to humans and our closest relatives. Now, there's only 3 vertebrate groups that have acquired the ability to fly, and that's birds, bats, and pterosaurs. They all do this a little bit differently. They all evolved this at different times. Birds have this, if you look at birds in isolation, if you just look at birds the way that early scientists were looking at birds. They have this unique combination of traits that we don't see in any other living group, and it makes them seem very different and hard to place on an evolutionary tree. But with all of these new fossils that we've been finding, especially since the 1990s, which to me seems like 2 years ago, and it's actually like 30 years ago, all of these new finds from China and from other places are showing us that a lot of these traits first evolved in dinosaurs, early, before flight, before even feathers evolved, and then were accepted or used in flight later. One of the things that we are starting to understand better is how the brains of these different groups changed over this evolution of flight. So the way we get this is we CT scan the whole skull, and we digitally infill where the brain would be in order to get a three-dimensional representation of the brain. And it turns out that these, what we call endocasts, actually correspond very well to the shape of the brain in that space. The brain fills the brain case in birds the same way it does in mammals. So when you fill out that space, you actually get a really nice little brain model. And we can use that to test differences in shape and size and distribution of parts, and get an idea of how their biology shifted. Cool. So with that in mind, I studied the dodo as sort of a case study in what happens when birds lose their ability to fly. And what I wanted to understand is there a major difference in flightless birds versus their closest flying relatives? So this is my case study. We have one extinct species, the dodo, and all of these modern relatives, and I wanted to see if there's notable differences in brain shape between the two. So dodos get a really bad rap. That, especially in popular culture, they're pictured as giant, dumb, flightless birds that went extinct because they didn't know better. Lots of comics and representations of dodos just not getting it.
And what does that come from?
So when the island was first discovered, it was in the late 1500s by Dutch sailors, and the dodos had never experienced people before. And so when the sailors got there, they were like, hey, free meat. And they would basically, some accounts said they herded the dodos onto their ships and ate them for meat on their voyages. What probably happened is less on the consumption front and more on the sailors bringing in invasive species like rats and goats and pigs that would eat the dodo's eggs off the ground because they were ground dwellers, obviously, because they're flightless. And so they lost their habitat and they lost their ability to nest successfully. And so in less than 100 years between when the island was discovered, it took less than 100 years for the dodo to go fully extinct from that point. So that led to this modern idea that dodos are stupid, and that's not fair. That's not fair. Within that time, though, within those 100 years, those sailors made it to Europe and said, hey, we found this island with these weird birds on it, and people wanted these for their menageries. And so the sailors were tasked with bringing some live back to Europe, and those were painted. They were given these portraits. And so the first one was made in 1601 by de Bry. It's here on the left. And it depicts this very plump, very small winged bird. In 1602, a second portrait was made. Legend has it that this is actually the same bird as the one that de Bry pictured in 1601, and it had died in the interim. And so all of the black that you see here is actually decay from that decomposition process. Another one was pictured in 1626 by this person Savory, and you also see they're very spherical in all of these depictions. And what was happening was the sailors were stuffing these dodos into small compartments in their ships to get them back to Europe. They were being fed whatever the sailors had on hand, which was probably not the native diet of a dodo. And so the same thing happened to dodos that happens to us when we don't get exercise and we eat a bad diet, and that's that they got a little bit chunky on the way up to Europe. And so all of these depictions show these very spherical birds when really they would have had a more svelte appearance, and they would have had seasonal changes depending on food availability. Eventually, people got interested in these birds for science, and so in 1848, this is well after the dodo went extinct, Strickland and Melville pictured it here as a scientific specimen. The foot was also pictured and lost. That specimen no longer exists. And so in that context, I was looking at if this bird recently lost the ability to fly, does it show any variability from its closest relatives? This person, Janu, did a genetic analysis to figure out what kind of bird a dodo is, and it turns out it is a pigeon. So these are all modern pigeon species, and these two, Rhapis cuculatus is the dodo bird, and Pisophaps solitaria is the Rodriguez solitaire. It's another giant flightless pigeon that's also extinct from a nearby island. And here are some pictures of those. So all of these are living species. These two are extinct friends. So in order to answer this question about how brain shape changes, I CT scanned a specimen of each one of these from our collections and from the London collection. This is one of the only intact skulls that exists for dodos. It was on display, so they had to take it off display in the London Museum, CT scan it, and then put it back on display for me. I never got to see the specimen in person, because I'm in the US. They did it all and then sent me the scans, so that was a little bit saddening for me, but that's okay. They sent me these beautiful skull CT scans, and I filled in the brain case digitally and ended up with this lovely little model of a dodo brain. I compared this to all of the other pigeons I showed, but one thing I want to point out before we get a little bit zoomed out from here is this weird bulge that you can see kind of here. It's a little bit kind of spherical. It's symmetrical on either side. It's not anywhere on any of the other pigeons. So here, this is that same dodo scan. This is the solitaire, and then these are the other pigeons in the sample. And I labeled it with a question mark. You don't need to read any of the other labels on here, but it doesn't exist anywhere else. And it found that to be very interesting. This is a top-down view, so we're looking at the brain from above. And you can also see that this part, this feature up here, is the nasal lobe. It's the part that processes scent in birds. In most birds, the nasal lobe is quite small or really not significant in any way. Birds don't really use smell that much. In the dodo and in the solitaire, it's quite large. So that was another interesting feature here. This is a side view, so from the right side. And you can see that weird bulge doesn't exist on the solitaire either, but that nasal lobe is quite large and much smaller in everybody else. I'll get back to that in a second. The other thing I looked at is the semicircular canals. These are the inner ear portion that sense head rotation. So every time you move your head in any of these directions, this is the organ that senses that and tells your brain what your head is doing in space. I noticed that it has in this horizontal canal that's normally more flat and horizontal, hence the name. It had this little bend in it that I didn't really see in any of the other scans that I had made. So that was one of those features that struck me as odd. The last thing I did for the study was do a regression of endocranial volume. So the volume of the brain versus the mass of the body. So how big of a brain does this animal have in terms of its body size? The dodo is here in red and the solitaire is this white star. And you can see that the regression is almost a straight line and that the dodo falls right on that line. So really it's got a proportional brain volume for its body, comparable to something like a common pigeon that you would see in New York City, for example. Now, that, if you think about a pigeon in New York City eating garbage, it doesn't really strike you as something that's very intelligent, but you have to think about it in a broader context and understand that pigeons were used and trained as homing pigeons, as messenger carriers in the World Wars, and are actually quite smart for, what they are, which is pigeons. They're not the, the top of the most nested group of birds. They're not crow level smart, but they're also not very stupid. And so dodos were probably as smart as a common pigeon, and not these dumb little flightless birds that everyone makes them out to be.
So what is the dumbest bird then?
What is the dumbest bird? Oh. I instinctively want to say like a chicken, but that's really rude.
What I was thinking.
That's really rude to chickens, because chickens are quite smart too. So
they are smart, and we get to see the ones that probably are, bred to not be so smart. So
exactly. Birds in general are actually much smarter than people. I mean, we have this insult that's like, oh, you're such a bird brain, but like birds are really smart. So it's just, I don't know. I'm just gonna say birds are smart in general, and on the spectrum, the dodos are probably somewhere in the middle. That's my very politically correct answer. Okay, so back to the data. What were dodos using those large olfactory lobes, that large nasal scent region for? They were ground-dwelling birds. They ate little crustaceans and fruit and things off the ground, and so they were probably using their sense of smell to locate those food sources. That weird feature on the side of the brain here, turns out that the brain case was actually broken on either side, and so when you just fill in the brain using the boundaries, even when they're broken, you end up with a symmetrical feature. This was pointed out to me in review very kindly by my reviewer, and I went back and checked, and it was in fact correct. The brain case was broken. This is not a natural feature, and so I went back and fixed that, obviously. Now the story goes that the specimen in London was mounted by Richard Owen, and the way he mounted it was to stick a rod in the brain case and then turn it sideways. And so he ended up breaking the brain case on the inside when he mounted it. And that's where that damage came from. So that turned out to be an interesting little story.
Which is something you would have actually noticed if you had been able to inspect the original specimen, I suspect.
Yeah, I mean, it was pretty clear in the CT scans after it was pointed out to me, but it was one of those like, grad student mistakes that happen. I was glad that someone caught it in review and not, written something in response to the paper I wrote. So that project served as a small case study on my bigger project for what ended up being my dissertation, understanding avian brain evolution as a whole, using what happens when birds become flightless as a reverse analog for how dinosaurs evolved flight in the first place. So that led to this, my flying and flightless birds and brains. My big question was, when birds become flightless, does their brain return to a brain shape like what terrestrial dinosaurs had? Or does it remain more similar to modern flying birds? Now, this is one of those papers, the Dodo papers is one of those papers that I actually, I had an idea, I did pretty good research, and it got published pretty linearly. This one went through something like 50 drafts of text, 2 different journals, 15 versions of the analysis that I ran, because I kept having to go back and redo things, and it was a process. But it's available now from BMC Evolutionary Biology if you want to read more. Birds have this vast diversity that I mentioned earlier. And within that diversity, 16 of those clades evolved flightless members. And my hypothesis, like I said, is that those flightless birds return to a brain shape more similar to that of non-avian theropods. So I did a similar analysis as the dodo. I CT scanned 79 specimens, 28 species, 18 of those were flightless, 10 were flying. I filled in the brain cases and came up with these models. This is clearly just a sampling of the specimens I had. But you can already see that some of these have vastly different shapes from each other. And so part of this was to quantify how those shapes change. I also incorporated data that Amy Balanoff had taken for her dissertation. So I had a very broad sample of birds. I used geometric morphometrics to analyze this, and this is a statistical technique where you put landmarks in the same place on all of your specimens, and the analysis will calculate the central point of all of your specimens and rotate and translate all of them into the same orientation in shape space, so that you can analyze just how the shape changes and account for size and location of the scan and things like that. So this is what those dots look like, those landmarks. I placed them evenly around different lobes of the brain. It's something called sliding semi-landmarks instead of traditional landmarks. It's what we use when there's not really distinct features like you would get on a skull. And then what I got was this. So this looks really complicated. Each one of these symbols is a specimen. When you do this sort of statistical analysis, you can do a principal components analysis, and that takes all of those landmarks, and reduces them down to just a handful of axes that show you where the most variation occurs in your data set. And so here we have PC1 accounting for about 40% of the variation and PC2 accounting for about 17. And you can see these pink ones are the non-avian dinosaurs with this red star being Archaeopteryx. And as we move left in this graph, this is the radiation of modern birds. And so what we're ending up with is a distinction here between non-avian dinosaurs and modern aves. This includes the extinct things like our friend the dodo and some other extinct flightless birds in here, but they're all contained within this modern diversity. So what this is showing me is that flightless birds, modern or recently extinct flightless birds, do not return to a brain shape more similar to non-avian dinosaurs. They don't suddenly have a brain shape over here with this group. They're still grouping here. So their brain shape is actually more controlled by who they're related to rather than what they are doing with their bodies. Another similar analysis is using groups that I tell the analysis what they are. So I told the analysis, these are all my flightless birds, these are all my flying birds, these are all my terrestrial non-avian dinosaurs. And then having the computer do sort of a cross validation to see if it would group those in the same place. And the interesting thing here is our friend, the penguin, ended up more closely in the flying birds than in the flightless ones. And that kind of makes sense because penguins use this sort of subaqueous flight stroke to swim. So they're still doing stuff with their arms. I need to switch my sound. Apologize for that.
Can you guys still hear me? Okay. So this analysis came away with a couple of interesting points in that locomotor mode is not a strong predictor of brain shape. However, the divergence of those flightless relatives, the amount of time that flightless birds have had since becoming flightless is really short in comparison to how long non-avian dinosaurs and dinosaurs in general have been around. And so there might have just not been enough time for that brain shape to become different. The acquisition of a new behavior, so the actual evolution of flight, may have been a larger driver for brain shape rather than the loss of flight. So we saw here that there's this big divide between more terrestrial non-avian dinosaurs and the flying ones. So possibly what's happening is once flight is evolved, it becomes this threshold and you can't go back through that threshold once you've evolved flight. So possibly flight is the larger driver of evolution and not the loss of that behavior. The last thing I'd like to talk about is a scientific outreach communication project that I spearheaded. It's a book called She Found Fossils. Scientific communication and accessibility is something that I'm really passionate about and I feel is very important. And so I kickstarted this project with Abby West and Amy Gardner. And it's a children's book about women in paleontology that covers history, modern, and up and coming. And so I just want to give a shout out to Abby West and Amy Gardner, who were pivotal in making this project. We ran a really successful Kickstarter. And I before I get into the details of that, I want to say that we came up with this idea, and from the point at which we came up with the idea and the point at which we ran the Kickstarter, 4 years passed because we tried to get publishers interested in this kind of book with multiple biographies in it. And they kept coming back with, that's cool, but why don't you just focus on one woman? And I kept saying, that's not the point. There's a lot of us, we should all be showcased. And so I ran a Kickstarter to publish it ourselves instead of going through more traditional publishing means. We were fully funded in less than 24 hours and able to start working on this book really quickly. The process was I read a bunch of as much firsthand literature as I could from each of the people we were highlighting, and wrote a short biography. I also sketched what I had in mind for these pictures and left little notes for my illustrator, like she's kneeling, not the exorcist, because I couldn't really draw at that point. She's got this one long arm and this one short arm, and I was hoping that she would understand all of these things. And she came up with exactly what was in my brain from these drawings. And, the final ones are just absolutely beautiful. They're a little bit whimsical. They're based on firsthand imagery from the different places. We had little call outs on, important fossils. The text went through a number of revisions. Trying to add images into Microsoft Word documents is the worst thing on this planet. And so Abby imported everything into Illustrator and made these really beautiful pages, really dynamic and fun pages out of all the text and the images we had. We went through several versions of the covers. I know that this looks like I drew it, but this was a quick sketch that my illustrator made for me. I really liked the rainbow representation here. I find rainbows very appealing, but we also liked the real skin tone differences here, and the diversity we were trying to show. And so we combined the two ideas and had rainbow outfits and natural looking skin tones. And then we translated the book. I did the translation into Spanish, and then had an editor go through and make sure that everything looked good. And then we've just last month finished the Mandarin translation. The English and Spanish ones were done in 2017. This we've been working on for 4 years and has finally been published. It's available on Amazon. I'll be putting PDFs up on my website that will be a significantly less investment on people's behalf. So if you want a PDF copy, I'll make those available. And yeah, I'm really proud of this work that we did. We could not have done the Mandarin version without Dr. Zhuan Liu, who helped us with the editing. And it turns out if you don't speak or write a language, it becomes significantly harder to publish a book in that language. So we were really happy to have a dear friend of ours help us with the final production of this. And that's what I have for you. I hope you enjoyed.
All right, thank you so much. And Your research is fascinating, and it's really cool to see this book now coming out. And do you foresee it making it out into a lot of classrooms? And if so, is there a target age?
So the target age is 8 to 12. The text is a little bit advanced for 8-year-olds. So our hope was that parents would read it to kids, or older kids would read it to younger kids. And the imagery is really nice. All of the pages have little characters and Polaroids of the different women. I think the thing that I like best about it is not only do we go through history. Oh, I froze.
We still hear you.
Oh, okay.
There
Not
you
only
go.
do we go through
You're back.
history of the very well-known paleontologists like Mary Anning, we go through modern women who are currently professionals in the field, like Kathy Forrester, Karen Clayson, a bunch of others, Julia Clark come to mind. And then the last part, we asked on social media for people to submit selfies of themselves doing field work or doing lab work, if they were a grad student or undergrad or someone just interested in paleo. And so we have a map at the end of where all these people are located who are currently studying to become the next generation of paleontologists. So we tried to cover not only diversity of like ethnicities, ages, research topics, but also career paths in paleontology, because it's not just curators, it's not just professors. There's people doing SciComm, there's people out there creating mobile museums to take museums to people in like underserved populations. There's a lot of different things you can do in paleo, and we were trying to showcase all of that in one book. So
Wow, that's wonderful.
we did a pretty good job. We didn't get everybody in there because you can't. There's too many of us. But
One of the things you mentioned is, you didn't get to experience really dinosaurs until college. And I think that's the way it is for so many of us, even though the kids know a lot by going to the library and getting books oftentimes, or some other way, watching documentaries, but to actually be able to potentially get books like this into classrooms, I think is particularly exciting. And to have that diversity at the same time is really, really fun.
yeah, that was our Abby and I, when we were coming up with this idea, we realized that none of the books we had growing up really talked about women in paleontology at all. If they had any people in them, besides the dinosaur encyclopedias that we all had, they usually had men in them and not women. And so it was really important to show people that we're out there. It's becoming more equally represented. I'd say we're not there yet, but we're getting there.
It's changed so much though in the last 30 years. It's just incredibly exciting to go to a meeting and see the growing diversity, but we still have a long ways to go.
Yeah.
Well, I have one question about the research part before others chime in with questions. And you were talking about the dodo having maybe larger olfactory aspects. And so I was wondering how, if that's common across, and maybe you said this, is that common across the ground dwellers? And at the same time, do you see a potential decrease in vision lobes?
So I would say in general, birds don't really rely on their olfactory sense. Birds are really visual. That's part of the reason why we get so many colors and bright aspects to different birds. The only other birds that really are olfactory driven are things like vultures or carrion feeders, because they have to be able to smell that food stuff from very far away. And it turns out, from what I understand, that those carrion feeders don't actually do it. They don't actually increase their olfaction capabilities by increasing their nasal lobes. They actually do it by increasing the number of olfactory receptors in their nasal passages. And so they're increasing a different aspect of that sensory apparatus than the part in their brain.
So you don't really see it then in the actual cast or in the endocast.
I think that's true. From my understanding, that's what I've come to understand. Yeah, so dodos and the Rodriguez solitaire both having this enlarged olfactory region of their brain is actually a pretty unique circumstance, and it makes me wonder what exactly about their habitat required them to increase that processing rather than having just an increased number of olfactory receptors. Is it something like being able to tell, because they eat partially, fruit off the ground. Is it partially being able to tell if something's fermented and not as good? Lots of questions that I don't know that we'll be able to answer, given that we can't observe them.
Yeah, I wonder about isotope studies of their bones to maybe parse out their diet a little bit better, but I'm sure nobody wants you to cut up dodo bones at this point.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's go to some other questions.
Yeah, I guess we don't have Grant Boardman on the call today. Otherwise, he'd say he's one of our regular listeners, and he says, "Well, what about the isotopes?"
I have no information on isotopes, unfortunately.
So I have a question. Coming back to She Found Fossils. First of all, thank you to you and your co-authors for writing that book. There was definitely a need, definitely a niche. I bought a copy for my 8-year-old daughter at the time. And she really enjoyed it. And then we donated it to various classrooms and that sort of thing. So great book. Thank you. What kind of response have you gotten from it? I mean, I assume it's mostly positive, but are there some? Are you getting kids coming out of the woodwork and basically saying, "Hey, this is cool. You're you're famous now," and that sort of thing? Where is this going?
So not so much. I haven't hit the New York Times bestseller list with that, unfortunately. But it was a small project. It is up on Amazon, which is a really accessible way to get it. We've had some setbacks with it in that because it was self-published, it's a little bit harder for libraries and schools to get copies of it. So I think that's part of the reason why the response hasn't been like grandiose. All of the feedback I've gotten has been really positive, to the point where many people are asking when volume 2 is coming out. And to that, I have to say, if a publisher wants to meet with me and talk about a volume 2, I'm happy to pursue that, but I don't think I can do it on my own, even with my wonderful team with me. Now, to combat some of that difficulty in getting this book out to libraries, I know that me and Abby have both been donating copies where we can to different libraries and schools. Part of our Kickstarter was donating copies for a certain level of kickstarting. We'd donate a copy to a different institution, and so we've done that. And our next step now is raising enough money from the profits of the book. We've been basically hoarding the profits and not using them for anything except like publication issues, like with the Mandarin version. Taking that money and then investing it so that we can donate copies to a nonprofit called First Book that provides books at a very, very reduced cost to underserved and underrepresented schools. And so that's our next step, is getting enough money to be able to donate something like 500 copies, I think is our goal.
See, we're in Tennessee, and in Tennessee, Dolly Parton reigns, supreme. And Dolly Parton has the Dolly Parton early reading library or something like that. My kids were getting these books every month. So right now, that you're on Paleo Talks, I'm sure they'll be knocking on your door. Hundreds of thousands of books. Yes.
I mean, that's, part of the reason why we put it in the 3 most spoken languages on the planet, is so that, kids everywhere could pick up a copy and not only see someone that looks like them represented in the book, but also, be able to read it in their language.
Yes. That's awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Well, at this point, we do have a bunch of questions that have come in about birds from our audience. Yay. So everybody, as a reminder, if you have questions, now's the time to submit them, and we will go ahead and get them asked here. Sorry, there are more comments coming in as I'm trying to speak. So we've got a couple more questions, and then I've got some questions to ask you. I'm going to bring us back to the subject of the book in a little bit, but let's start with a question from Charlie. Charlie asks, what made you choose dodos as a case study for this research? what other species would you be interested in using as other case studies?
Ooh, okay, good questions. The dodo, I just like, I don't know, I felt some sort of kinship with it for no reason, given that I'm not from Mauritius. And, you know, it was just one of those birds that I really wanted to get my hands on and study it. It's rare. It's really interesting. It has this whole pop culture reference, you know, beyond just Alice in Wonderland. It just keeps popping up in like Looney Tunes and things. Ice Age, you know, all of these things that I grew up with reference dodos, and I think that's what drove me wanting to understand them more. There's this flightless owl that I really wanted in my sample because owls are spectacular. They're so cool. And I just couldn't find one in any collection that had an intact skull. Because you don't need a lot for these studies, but you do need an intact skull in order to come up with these digital brain models. And so I couldn't find one and I couldn't get it in my analysis, unfortunately. But that's on my want list. So if anybody out there has one of those flightless owls, send it my way.
Michaela asks, oops, oh, I lost it. All right, we're back. Michaela asks, I saw the great auk briefly pop up for flightless birds. Did you get a chance to scan or see what a great auk brain looked like?
I did actually. If I was in my office, I'd be able to grab the skull that I 3D printed from it. I had two great auks in my analysis. Both of them were skulls made of different specimens. They were composite skulls. And so, I didn't want to use them as the forefront of a case study because they're not individuals. They're a bunch of different individuals stuck together. And so it's a little bit less scientifically sound, I think. I still included them in my analysis because the brain case itself, I believe, was one piece. But yeah, the takeaway with the great auks was that their brains look like flying relatives of theirs, just like, flightless ducks look like flying ducks in terms of brain shape. So nothing quite as interesting or different in great auks.
All right, and Sarah asks, if flight drives brain changes, does this affect mate choice? I.e., can birds tell if, mates have good flight muscles or coordination or behaviors that show good flight? Is there some sort of correlation between, between mate choice and flight?
That's a really interesting question. I think mate choice is driven more by things like sexual selection. If groups are already sort of set to prefer the bright colors or long tails or beaks of different shapes in some cases, then that's what they'll end up preferring, and that's what will be emphasized in future generations, rather than flight muscle ability. That said, individuals that have weaker flight muscles for whatever, maybe pathology or disease or some other thing that's affecting that, injuries, are probably going to be less successful in reproduction in nature. And that might be the difference, rather than having that be like having really good, like a super buff bird be the mate choice. I think the reverse is probably more true. Good question.
All right, and then I'd like to bring us back to the subject of your book. First, I want to point out, so I put, for anyone who's interested, I put a link to the Amazon link for the book in the Facebook comments. So if anyone wants to follow it, and we have had, since you started talking about it, 2 people in the comments comment that they just ordered the book.
Oh, thank you.
Larry says, just ordered, she found fossils for my granddaughters. And Janice says, I just ordered the book. Thank you for writing a book on this subject.
Yeah, I was thinking you should do some kind of a challenge or something like that on getting paleontologists to support local schools. Maybe you could even do it in the auction.
I put it in the SVP auction. I put a couple of copies the last time we were in person.
becoming a challenge,
Oh yeah,
to buy them for local schools.
that's actually a great idea. I do that. Thank
Ooh.
you.
I mean, we have a gift shop at the museum. Maybe we could, I don't know how it works getting books for the gift shop. Maybe we can look into that.
One of
Go
the
ahead.
museums in New Jersey actually contacted me directly about getting books, and I just shipped them straight to them and wrote an invoice, and it was fine. So if you are interested, just let me know. I'm happy to facilitate that.
Okay. All right. I'll talk to our friends at Hands On who are in charge of the gift shop these days. Cool. I did want to ask you a question. You mentioned you were telling the story of getting the book done, and you said that you went through a number of publishers who weren't interested in the book, but then your Kickstarter was funded in a day, and it sounds like you've had quite a lot of enthusiastic response. You've had enthusiastic response in this presentation from our commenters. So it sounds like there is a demand and a want for stuff like this, but that there was a disconnect between the audience and the publishers. What does that mean to you in terms of this kind of material, in terms of the difference between the supply and the demand of this kind of product?
Yeah, at the time when I had first started approaching publishers with this idea, there weren't really collections of biographies of women on the market. There were individual biographies of women. That was a thing that has existed for a long time. But these books that are collection, like Goodnight Stories for Rebel Girls, that is just a collection of biographies of cool women that did cool stuff. That didn't exist when I first started with this idea. And I remember in that period of those years that I had come up with the idea and I couldn't get publishers interested, I saw that book in, I think at the MCZ, at the Harvard gift shop. And I turned to my mom, who was there visiting with me, saying, like, I knew it was a good idea. It's a good idea. Like, I know it's a good idea. I don't understand. And I sat with it for so long, and I just don't, I think part of it is that publishers, part of their drive is what will be successful on the market. And so that is informed by what has been successful on the market. And it's sort of this, loop of like, well, it's never been on the market. So how could it be successful? So their data don't show that a book like that would be successful. Therefore, why not do what has been successful in biographies of single people, single women or whatever. And it was like, that's not the point. That's eliminates the entire purpose behind the book if I do that, and therefore I'm not going to do that. Like, that's not what I want to do. That's not the idea here. And I'm really glad that I stood by my guns and said, no, I know it's a good idea, and I'm gonna do it. And the fact that I got funded in under 24 hours, it's like, good. Yes, this will be good. This will work.
Well, that's great. I think that that's a really exciting story of being, it has that very exciting underdog, cinematic story of, all of the big wigs said no, but you made it happen anyway, which is a fun story in and of itself. But I think it's really exciting because now you've got a case study. Now you've got, hey, we did this thing and it was a real success. And I think it would be my extended hope, and I'm sure you share this, is that there will be people who see this and follow your example. That maybe this is one of those bigger steps in that change that Blaine had mentioned earlier, and in our progress towards making these things happen.
Yeah, I'm hopeful of that too. And in the interim, even before our book came out, a different book about a collection of women paleontology stories, Daring to Dig, came out as well. And so there's been this uptick in the amount of books on women in paleontology in the last 5 years, and it's really great. It's really great to see. There's ones for kids, there's ones for adults. It's becoming a thing, and I'm very happy to have been a part of it.
Yeah, congratulations. That's fantastic. All
Yeah,
right.
so thank you so much for doing that and being a leader in that way. It's so important right now.
I appreciate the support. Thank you.
Chris, I wanted to ask you something. Is by any chance is that orange case behind you full of flightless owl skulls?
If it is, I haven't opened it. Yeah, it's not
Well,
not a good idea.
ship it her way if it is. So
Flightless owl. It might be ostrich leg bones or something. Yeah.
all right.
I eagerly await it in my mailbox.
Flightless owls. I was thinking, do I know of any flightless owl specimens? No, I can't help you.
Burrowing owls, but
Yep.
Yeah.
where are these flightless owls from?
I think it's another, I mean, when I came across that, it was almost like 2011 or 2012, almost a decade ago at this point.
Right,
That
right.
it, probably an island species, if I had to guess. I haven't, as soon as I saw there were no specimens, I sort of put it out of my memory. So.
All right, David, how are we on time? We're time to wrap up?
Yeah, we are right about at the end. So thank you, as always, to all of our people who submitted questions. We always like getting the chance for the audience to participate in the Q&A, and we will have more Paleo Talks coming in the future.
All right. Thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. We'll see you next time.